Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of The Brood. I am Josh, and Chris is here with us. Say hi,
Hi.
Chris.
Hello, how are you?
And Letitia.
Hi.
And this time we're going to talk about the So Bad They're Good category, or some other catchy name for this not really category of films, but really kind of a whole um, bizarre subcategory, or I don't really know. Is it larger than that? All I know is that when I was a teenager and we went to the video store, there was actually a whole section at the video store that was the So Bad They're Good, and I think I mined that thing for everything there was. And so we've chosen three movies, very, very different movies, all of them in their own way uniquely bad. And so we're going to talk about those films a little bit and then see if we can dive into the question of what these movies might have for us, I guess, on an aesthetic level, why I at least enjoy them so much. And I think we might hear some dissenting voices in there. Not just the kitten, either. But. Chris, would you like to start us out just chronologically? We'll just start with your choice for this time.
Yeah, I chose. I knew I was going to choose a film by the New York filmmaker Andy Milligan, who has quite a lot of to choose from in the way of really, really bad movies. But it's a film called Torture Dungeon from 1970, and it's a period piece, a medieval period piece that involves a lot of, I guess, kind of political intrigue and sex and violence in the Middle Ages. And I was actually a little worried that maybe this might not, totally be a horror film in like a kind of traditional sense, but I mean, it's a pretty violent, loathsome kind of affair. But anyway, yeah, it's about, like I said, like the story's not particularly important, but it involves some political intrigue and some kind of like almost Shakespearean references, almost a Richard III, I feel like, kind of thing going on, at least in a very superficial kind of way. But yeah, anyway, that was my pick, and I chose it, I think, because it does something that I feel the best quote unquote bad films do, and I feel like it takes the freedom that can come from making something on such a low budget and in such a kind of marginalized place, and really does some pretty wild aesthetic things with it, as well as some, bizarre story thing and performance. And it really uses like, it's kind of marginalized place to do some really, I feel, pretty interesting things. So that was the reason I chose this film.
The next choice, my choice, was see if I can actually get the name correct this time. The Sorority Babes in the Slime Bowl Bowl-orama. It makes me feel proud to say it out loud like that.
Yes.
And I first came across this movie, as with so many of these, from another treasure trove of my childhood, which was USA's Up All Night, which was
boy.
just a weekly late night show where they'd play movies with titles like Sorority Babes and Slime Bowl Bowl-orama.
Yeah.
And
an educational program. I mean,
exactly, yeah. Taught me a lot about the world. And this film's from 1988, and it definitely a few rungs up on the ladder budget-wise from, say, a Torture Dungeon. There's something close to production value here. Whether it's put to good use is another question. I'm trying to. I find myself doing this a lot, where I'm not sure if I can even attempt to summarize the plot. Basically, some very kind of college sex comedy kind of stuff that ends up with a dare to go steal a trophy. There's some sort of demonic creature within a trophy at the bowling alley, and hijinks ensue. It really just very, very silly, very, very 80s, very kind of over the top, and I think all kinds of fun. But
Oh yeah.
so that was my pick. Tisha, you want to talk about your Pride and Joy?
Do I have to? Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah, so I chose a movie I'd never seen or heard of randomly from Netflix because it looked like it was trying to be a bad film, or maybe was genuinely bad, but it's definitely not so bad it's good. It's just mostly bad. But it's Chillerama, which is I think from 20. It's pretty recent. Yeah, 2011. Yeah, and it's basically a kind of anthology film. There's 4 stories by 4 different directors. I think they're all directors who have something to do with the horror genre. I only recognize one of them, whose name I'm blanking on, who did the Hatchet movie and Frozen. What's that director? Adam Green is one of the directors of one of the segments. Yeah, so one of them like kind of a spoof of a monster movie. One is kind of a spoof of werewolf movies plus beach movies, which sounds really fun but isn't. And there's a zombie, kind of a overarching zombie movie thing, and a strange and not really that effective Nazi comedy horror movie. So it's like an anthology movie. And it's really playing with a lot of the things that we'll probably talk about later. And I guess we can just go into that later. But it's not very effective. And it'll be fun to talk about why it's not effective, I think.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Yeah. So the first question that we should probably open up, if we're going to have an entire show talking about, watching bad movies, is why? What... And I know, Letitia, I'm probably going to ask you to start us out here because I know you're a little resistant to this whole kind of concept of enjoying the badness and that this really isn't your cup of tea. And so I think I might be too close to it myself. But, what is the experience? Because obviously this is miles away from that immersive experience that you get from watching like a great film, right? Mm-hmm. Where your life disappears and you just get sucked up into this movie. This is pretty far from that. So let me throw that out there. Why would we spend our time watching things that we recognize are substandard or, sub-substandard?
I feel like I shouldn't start because I don't know why.
We should.
I have a few ideas about why, we enjoy this. These things that, I guess, for shorthand, we call them so bad they're good. But I think, just like you said, they resist this immersive experience that, we kind of associate with great films. And I think something that, these really immersive kind of, these films that have this kind of verisimilitude, what they deny us is a kind of a pretty basic, direct view of kind of the seams that hold things together. And, in a way, the artifice, is something that we're denied any kind of like, or anyway, knowledge of. And I think these films give us that. Like, I think bad films are very material in a sense. And that is kind of where I think where my love of them comes from. Obviously, I love them too because of just ridiculous camp. And I think we should definitely talk about the article about on camp that you circulated, Josh. That's definitely a part of it. But I think the materiality that is kind of manifest in like something like Torture Dungeon, or something like Sorority Babes is. Or Ed Wood, or any number of movies where, it's very clear that this was something that human beings made. And it's a very localized event and an actual reality. And you look at a film that was constructed. I think there's a pleasure in that you don't get from more immersive, larger, slicker films.
It's funny because I hadn't thought about it that way at all. And it sounds like what you're describing is kind of like the bad film as modernist film. As art that holds as its subject its own artifice, that it's going to, the film is its own subject. And of the three films that we watched, it seems like the one that's closest to that kind of way of thinking in terms of intentionality would be Chillerama, which is also the least successful.
Yeah.
If we're talking about like a modernist poet or something that's really trying to bring our attention to the materiality of the poem as object or something, that's an intentional move, and it works or it doesn't. But so much of what works with these kinds of movies seems to me to be unintentional.
Absolutely. No, I think that's where, for me, that's something that I feel is hard to reconcile. I mean, what I can think of is maybe something like maybe Torture Dungeon. There might be some consciousness there, and I think Sorority Babes there is as well. But I mean, we can't say that for something like, Plan 9, really, or like the pits, like the worst. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have really.
Of these three we saw, I think Torture Dungeon was my favorite because of what Chris brought up about the idea of the movie sort of showing its themes, like, that you can see a regular coffee table underneath a tablecloth that's appearing to be something from the medieval, era. Or people have like these wildly not uniform accents. Some people sound like they just got off the bus from, I don't know, New Jersey or something.
Yeah.
Some people sound like they're trying to have an accent. I found that really charming. And that movie was so weird. I couldn't get a handle on intentionality versus not, or whether it was sincere in places or not. Like, to me, that movie had that golden thing that made me almost interested in bad movies. But go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that's the best thing that a bad quote. I'm just gonna go with the bad film name, that a bad film can do, is open up this world of, because when you see something strange and all these kind of like incongruous kind of elements that were there, that's, for lack of a better term, weird, or at least strange, and it unsettles you. And I think in that sense, that unsettling, which isn't necessarily unpleasant, opens up possibilities. And when you see this is another way that a film can function, and that's what I think that's why I think, some of these tropes of bad films have been taken up by, the avant-garde, because there are aesthetic and kind of all kinds of possibilities for these kind of tropes and techniques, and I think that's what's exciting about, Torture Dungeon. And I think that's also going on in Sorority Babes as well, is these kind of, elements being utilized, and the level of self-awareness, I think, in Sorority Babes is what makes it kind of, something outside of the norm. Chillerama, I just don't know. I wish I could have taken a picture of my face while I was watching that film. And I was really open to liking it, because I like Adam Green and I like Adam Rifkin. And my God, I don't know what happened there.
What happened? I thought my husband would love that movie before I watched it, because he loves bad movies, and I put it in and he was there, and we started, and he's like, "You made your friends watch this movie?" He said, "What? Did you apologize?" And I don't know, I just expected it to be fun, and that was totally missing. The other two were fun, I gotta say, I don't love this genre, and I can talk about why in a minute, I guess, but it was at least fun. Like, I wouldn't watch them again, and I won't seek out other movies of this type, but it was nice made to watch.
I'll just keep sending you lists of them until you. But I want to go back to Josh, to what you said, because I feel like I kind of skirted the question, like this question of the intentional, like, versus the unintentional, and why that matters. I don't know. I all I can say right now is that I don't really, I don't have a solid basis for that.
Well, I kind of, while you were talking, I was thinking that there's something that maybe intentionality isn't even really the thing. There's something about Torture Dungeon seems in some way brutally authentic. You know, that there's something very honest about it, and you know that's kind of sad, but at the same time there's something just kind of lovely in the kind of DIY punk rock aesthetic of just like 15 people in New Jersey or something deciding to make a medieval Shakespeare knockoff and being completely unprepared to pull that off. And I really do feel that. And then Sorority Babes, you said that, that kind of level of self-awareness. I think that's a whole other level, a different type of movie that is trying to kind of co-opt that authenticity, that wants to give that impression, but is maybe a little too self-aware for its own good in order to. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think what the interesting thing about Sorority Babes is it's a movie that is, I think you could say it's co-opting. I would more say that it's just aware of the conventions, but it's still a cheap movie. You know what I mean? I think that's what makes that's what I like about it, is that it's a very low budget, film that it is aware of the tropes of its own genre, but not in a kind of sycophant, I don't know how to explain, like the way that Chillerama is, this panderous, just evil thing. But it's, Sorority Babes hits a really a sweet spot that kind of really works. Do you know what I mean? That it's not, because I mean, it's not a big movie really, and I think it just uses that awareness to, be very frank about what it is, but have fun with what it is too.
It makes me think kind of, it's not quite at this level of big movie, but do you all remember the whole Planet Terror, Death Proof double feature kind of thing?
Yes.
That was the first time I really saw a big movie really explicitly trying to be a B movie. Like, so there's like different tropes. There's like the B movie, there's the badly made movie, like with the missing reel, like the idea that a movie is just simply missing parts.
Yeah.
And then there's just like a sort of parody of bad acting and certain certain expectations. And so I think there's like 3, probably more, things happening that are somehow satisfying enough that we want to pretend that they're there when they don't have to be.
Well, yeah, what I think you're talking about there is a couple of filmmakers desperately trying to recreate that experience that I was trying to ask about at the beginning. What is that when you're, just munching popcorn, watching trash? I'm not sure why that is satisfying, or
I think I think I want to address because bringing up Grindhouse is really, I think, significant, and because Chillerama is definitely in the mold of Grindhouse, and these films that want to like kind of pay tribute and reappropriate these tropes of these bad movies and this and also down to this very kind of like I don't know, like even this materiality that we're talking about, like the scratches and the missing reel. But the difference is in something like Torture Dungeon, and I think still kind of with Sorority Babes, there's a freedom that comes from this aesthetic roughness and these kind of like cheapness. There's a liberation there, and when you canonize that kind of, or like kind of make these conventions rigid of what's a bad film, it stifles that, and I think that's why I kind of like turn away from these, as loving tributes as they are. It denies the kind of radical possibilities of bad filmmaking, when we turn it into something kind of dead, like in a certain sense.
Yeah, no, I keep coming back to this kind of punk rock metaphor, but I mean, I think I hear what you're, in Torture Dungeon, nobody was, rewriting the script because the producers wanted a change, because there were no producers.
Yeah. They'd be
So-
rewriting because somebody's car broke down and they couldn't get there.
Well, because they didn't write it the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that and I think that there is something, I think that it takes like one step away from that kind of pure low budget kind of thing that we see in Torture Dungeon, to where it does start to become, it looks like a nice kind of capitalist exploitation of that experience, that it's all about repackaging it to sell, and I agree, there's something a little off-putting about that. At the same time, I think that to me, genre is good for very little, except as a frame to hang stuff on. And I think that Death Proof is probably the best movie that Tarantino's ever made.
I agree. Oh my god, I'm so glad.
That is, there is this is weird because I really enjoy that film as well, and I don't meet a lot of people that do.
Yeah, it's my favorite Tarantino. It's the best. But see, Tarantino's a big control freak, which is the thing about people who love these kinds of movies and then want to do homages. Like, there's directors who, like, Tarantino wouldn't go out and make a movie without knowing what he's going to do ahead of time and have carefully planned. And the kind of beautiful thing about these movies is that you get a sense that it's kind of zen. It's like, whatever happens, happens. Whereas someone like Tarantino or other directors who use bad movies, we talked about this in our emails a lot, like someone like David Lynch, for example. These are directors who are never going to give control over to, like, some kind of spontaneous experience. They're control freaks, and that kind of makes the movies beautiful, I guess, in a way. They're very much pieces of art, and that's what they intend to be, but they also don't have the sort of messiness that makes Torture Dungeon fun. But I prefer control, because I just like to see a controlled product that's been, like, I don't know. So, yeah, anyway.
No, that makes sense. I think that a good counterpoint to that, someone who is very film literate, but I think operates with a lesser degree of control, is maybe someone like John Waters.
Yeah.
Like, who, although, I'm sure he does have in the earlier films, I can imagine there's a degree, there's a large degree of chance, with certain things that they were capturing. But yeah, I think that's a good example of how you can make something pretty substantial with, still employing that kind of a lesser degree of control. But I agree with what you're saying, though. I was going to bring up to you, Josh, this is a very kind of brief thing, but what you were saying about, like, eating popcorn or chips or what have you, and watching these bad movies, and why we get such pleasure out of this. I feel like a reason why I enjoyed watching just this garbage that nobody cared about so much is because they come with less context.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're watching Jaws, it's like you have, however many years of what Jaws is and Jaws' place in our popular culture and society. When you just find some piece of crap at the video store, it's a very personal, I think, intimate kind of experience with something that you almost have more freedom in your experience with that film, I feel, because it's less dictated by the culture and this sometimes over, this ubiquity of certain films and ideas behind certain films. No one can watch Star Wars, without the idea of Star Wars, like kind of being there. I don't know, that's a pretty broad example, but I think that factors into it to a degree.
Well, and one of the things that I worry about, and I worry about this because I do enjoy these types of movies, is that at least half of the experience is kind of that Mystery Science Theater 3000 kind of, that you can laugh at these films, that there is a certain amount of, and I worry about that because it seems a bit mean-spirited, that there's something a little kind of pointed in that kind of experience. Like,
I agree. I sometimes have felt there's certain bad films I love so much. Like, I feel I would be defensive to a degree if someone was, with Torture Dungeon. But I agree. I don't want to engage in that kind of just mockery. But I think that's a very, the ability to laugh at a film, I think, is a very liberating experience as well. You know what I mean? Like, we're laughing. I mean, let me try to unpack this kind of the best I can. Like, I feel in a certain sense that amateur filmmaking, like I like to call it, or this bad filmmaking, is almost political in a sense, because these are people, like, say, the people that made Torture Dungeon, to a degree, that will not have access to wouldn't normally have access to film equipment or be able to make a film. But by changing the rules and aesthetic, kind of values or standards, they can make a movie. And how 40 years later we saw that film, and it's a film, and we're considering it. And I think there's a power, and there's a kind of democratization that happens with changing of the rules and anybody being able to make a movie. That being said, it's strange that those movies always just kind of reuse the structures of popular films and these kind of ideas that are already there. But I think that's kind of, anyway, I think that's kind of necessary so that they can be they can be legitimate in some sense. But that being said, they still give us the ability to just laugh, to just laugh at the idea that, how ridiculous it is to sit and watch, I don't know. I think it just opens up, it pulls back the curtain, and that in its sense, some of that laughter is like more powerful than I think some genuine sentiments, I'm quoting in the air here, that you get from a good film. I think that laughter is powerful, and you might be laughing at it, but in that sense, you're laughing at a lot of films when you're doing that. Is that making sense at all?
And there's a sense, and I think I've probably got Tarantino on the brain now, but there's probably a sense in what you're saying that bad films are probably a pretty great film school.
Yeah.
I mean, when you consider your models, that there's definitely a lot to learn from them.
Okay, yeah. Well, this is kind of slightly off topic, but it seems to me like you guys love this genre because there's kind of a nostalgia to it for you. And it sounds to me, Chris, I don't know, maybe I'm just hearing you wrong, but it sounds like viewing these kinds of movies for you is maybe a group thing, like maybe showing somebody a movie or watching a movie with somebody. And Josh, you mentioned like a particular channel. Like, I just didn't have this experience of nostalgia around watching bad movies or finding them at the video store or like eating popcorn in my room. Like, I feel like there's a sort of experience, and sometimes maybe even a group experience, to these kinds of films that I just I didn't have access to, and now I feel like it's kind of lost to me forever, and it makes me kind of sad.
But I think that was part of it. Definitely, there was there was a lot of solitary viewing, but there was a lot of group, viewing, and this kind of sense of discovery and sharing. Mm-hmm. And I think those feelings are tied to it for me. But I think we have a similar kind of. I think there's a lot of YouTube is kind of taking, I think, the place of a lot of what I experienced, and I think what Josh experienced, and there is. I think that it's translatable to our times.
You're gonna make me cry, Chris. You're gonna make me cry.
I'm sorry.
No, I think I think that you're right, that there is something a little bit maybe more communal about it. In the way you experience those movies, that if you're watching, you would hush somebody during some other movies, whereas you would never shush someone during Torture Dungeon. You'd be commenting all the way through. You'd be it's like, and I guess that might be part of it, is it's like it almost invites you into dialogue with the movie. Like you wanna it does, it kind of invites you to comment, and like there's this constant kind of critique happening as the movie's going.
I think that's very true, and I think that that it's funny that we think it's strange. We would say that a bad movie is it's bad because we want to talk during it or we want to engage with it in that way. But I feel like someone like to a degree like Godard invites something like that. You know what I mean? And definitely uses tropes of bad films and definitely tropes of genre films in their films as far back in over time these things become very serious affairs. But I think that yeah, we shouldn't make any. I don't think there's a need to ever make apologies for liking films that kind of lay themselves bare and invite you to be active. I think that's because they're constantly mined. There has to be a power there because they're mined over and over. And we see that in things like, say Super 8, this film, that was, a big hit. That film is a love letter to a degree to these, homemade amateur films. All these kind of found footage films we've made reference to are borrowing aesthetics of consumer cameras, and that's one step away, I feel, from amateur filmmaking.
The appropriation of amateur filmmaking for your big budget hit,
Yeah. I mean, so it's we kind of laugh at these films that are incompetent and cheap, but maybe that is these larger, maybe that is the status quo's, ability to kind of always, mask their sources, in this kind of cultural hegemony, kind of way.
Authenticity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I take a bit of issue with that, even though it's a kind of inevitable, trend, change that's going to happen in appropriation, but it shouldn't be at the expense of these films being just. I was just about to say, shouldn't be at the expense of these films being marginalized, but that they, part of their charm is that they're marginalized, I think, to a degree.
I want to reference the Susan Sontag essay, Notes on Camp. And camp is one word that we could be using to describe these instead of bad movies, but I don't think that's even necessarily true. Certainly for some of them. I definitely think Torture Dungeon would fall into that category. It's very campy. Whereas other of these movies are attempting to be campy and maybe failing. But I really appreciate her kind of basic definition of what camp is, which is, one, a degree of seriousness, maybe too much seriousness, and also this degree of there just being too much, that it's that it contains some quality that's just overflowing, and that that we use phrases like "it's too much" to describe it. And so I want to throw that out there, and then I want to see if I can really trouble the waters here. And because we've been using badness in a lot of ways as a shorthand to talk about low-budget films, and I mean, because there's obviously multiple levels of badness, and I mean, I could list, if you ask me, the last 20 years of Steven Spielberg's career has been making bad, campy movies. That he's making movies that are overly serious to the point of being silly, and just contain an overabundance of something that I find offensive. That while operating with outrageous budgets, and so I guess I want to maybe kind of trouble the waters a little bit with what we mean when we talk about a bad film.
I think that's a great question, because we had a great email conversation about bad acting specifically, and I think usually when you think of a bad film, one of the things that you think of is bad acting. And as we discussed by email, I kind of realized that I don't quite know what that means, because we have so many examples of acting that is stiff or extremely unnatural, for example, or that is intentionally drawing attention to itself that is not bad acting because it has a particular purpose. And particularly like directors like Lynch, I keep coming back to him, but there's others, there's many, many others, where people intentionally act in ways that are, even campy, as we say, or stiff or whatever. So the more we talked about badness, the less I understood about what makes something bad, or even if that's a category that makes sense, and if the category instead should be successful or unsuccessful, or
yes.
Yeah.
I agree absolutely, especially with this idea of bad acting. Mm-hmm. I think because at a glance you could look at a Bresson film and say, well, this is bad. These people aren't even acting, or look at Fassbinder and be like, what is this? Like, that's not psychological realism, or that's not, or whatever, and I think that what it does is that, when we start to realize that, what we see as bad acting is simply just a deviation. Now I'm going to stop for a second. There's just people that can't act and it's just bad. Okay. But then what I think we really mean sometimes by bad acting is this deviation from this kind of institutionalized naturalism that you find in a lot of big budget movies. And what you have, and you know what I mean? And so anything that isn't that is either too much or it's just bad. And I think that films should, have it should be a choice. A performance should be a choice. A performance style should be a choice. Mm. The role of acting in a film should be a choice and not just an assumption. And I think a lot of times sometimes I think bad films are considered such now, yes, because some are just poorly constructed and not in a pleasurable way. But, they're necessary to a degree to reinforce the idea of kind of what is good. I think they reinforce standards, of what is good and bad. But I think with a good, bad film, you realize that a lot of that's kind of arbitrary,
Well, as you said that, I was thinking about, like, for me, one of my touchstones, one of my favorite movies of all time is Maltese Falcon, which Sontag actually mentions in her essay, and the delivery of the lines in that movie is most of the fun of watching it, and it's completely out of control. There's nothing naturalistic about it, and but it totally works in kind of in its context. And you watch a movie like Brick, which lifts that same kind of banter, that's a lot of the same dialogue, and puts it in a different context, and looks at how weird it is, and how where it just becomes like alien because it's taken out of that. I think you're onto something there.
I
go ahead.
I think we're looking for a kind of but I think the question becomes, though, this like a harmony. Does it strike a harmony? In the Maltese Falcon, there's a harmony there, and I think that, but is that always something that, is that obviously, now it's a bigger question about, just art in general. I feel like it's kind of getting into a complicated territory, but, I think maybe sometimes that's what we're looking for, maybe to a degree, this kind of that it quote unquote fits, in a certain way.
So Chris, are you saying that, like, so you say that, so acting should be intentional. It should be intentional to the specific project of the film.
Best case scenario, yes, but then we look at something like, Torture Dungeon, and there's several performance styles happening.
You could call
it. I'm torn, because I don't want to be, I'm not going to go and make this argument and kind of like twist the facts just to suit my purposes, which are, like the, quote unquote bad films as a radical kind of position, because some are it's just bad. Like, I don't know, like, it's just bad, but so there has to be a play to reconcile. My goal, Josh, I want you to leave this episode not feeling guilty at all about what you like.
no worries there. But
Okay.
I mean, but and you said this gets to become a bigger issue and it becomes a pretty serious conversation. But as soon as we start questioning what is good and what is bad, I think we're already there. And, and I look at, because Letitia raises a good point that one thing that we recognize about a bad film is that it's got bad acting, and there's definitely I think truth to that. But let's go back to a movie that maybe fits more into the horror genre a little better than some of the other examples that we've been using for the last few minutes. Shutter Island, a film full of A-list actors by one of our greatest living directors that, in my opinion, came out as a steaming pile. In what way is that movie bad and still in the same universe as Torture Dungeon?
Well, I think I might, now I have to take issue, I feel, because I feel like that film is a kind of, the end notwithstanding, like a kind of conscious exercise in a kind of genre-y type of filmmaking. Like I think that, but then again, I mean, we've discussed that a purposeful kind of like, invocation of like these tropes of like, I'm not going to say bad because that's more of a kind of pulpy Sam Fuller, old style B movie, that kind of gets in over its head. Consciously doing those things doesn't mean that it's going to be successful. But I guess that's neither here nor there whether we agree on whether it's good or not. But I think, or maybe that is the whole thing, but I do think that it is pretty campy, if when we were talking about it's too much. That movie is the score, it's over the top, but I feel like it's relentlessly so, and a very conscious exercise in that.
I can explain why Shutter Island's bad. It's Leonardo DiCaprio, who is terrible in almost everything I've ever seen him in. He is such a bad actor. I'm sorry, but I feel like he's an example of somebody who's straining so hard for naturalism that his face is it's always red and blubbery and his veins are popping. He's trying so hard to be real. And I kind of hate that kind of acting where you can see, I don't know. But also I was thinking of movies that are like Shutter Island. I thought Inception was terrible. I thought the dialogue was awful. I thought it was beautiful looking. There were interesting ideas, I guess, but like, that's the kind of movie that I think, why give such a big budget for? I don't know. We're kind of on the subject, but I think there is this thing that badness sometimes we don't see it in things that are not packaged.
Yeah.
The expectation of it being bad. Another one I think of incoherency when I think of bad movies. But then I saw Prometheus this summer, which I was so excited about. But that is a film that is at its core completely incoherent. Incoherent character-wise, incoherent story-wise. Nobody acts, so I think that a movie that sets up expectations and can't follow them, but not because they're trying to surprise you or do something interesting, but because there simply wasn't enough thought put into it. I don't know.
I agree with that completely, and I want to add to that the strange thing about something like these three films, Shutter Island, the Christopher Nolan one, I'm forgetting the name, that what you said, Inception, and my brain is going. Anyway, and Prometheus. These films that we could say, let's just for the sake of argument say they're bad, or they're incoherent to some degree, or they're like not in harmony with themselves. I think the thing that is interesting to look at is that these are very, very expensive movies, and the difference between something like Torture Dungeon and this is that if it's big and it's bad, it's still apparently worth your time. But if it's small and it's bad, you don't. If something's cheap, I think the connection with cheap and bad is very kind of telling about our consumer mentality about films.
Yeah, I think you can only hold that belief if you haven't visited the Cineplex lately, that there's any kind of correlation between budget and and quality. I mean, Hollywood's cranking out terrible movies every day, you know, but again,
but apparently they're still worth our time. There's this assumption that they're worth our time because they cost a lot of money, you know?
Right.
Or they're more legitimate in some sense, you know? I mean, this is like, you know, I'm being pretty romantic here, but...
So how much of that differentiation between, you know, the mainstream badness and what we're talking about here is kind of a genre prejudice? I mean, do you know what I mean?
I think that, yes. I think that they're... Okay, here's a one to kind of throw in there and take a look at. Showgirls.
Yeah,
You're not going to say anything bad about Showgirls, are you?
On the contrary, I'm going to say that's a film, a very large budget film that came out in the past 20 years, right? And that is celebrated for its just, you know, quote unquote badness, which I think is conscious. You know, Paul Verhoeven has a great track record. I think that's a film that is a very large budget bad movie, you know, and I think that's I don't know, I just thought that's an interesting one to look at because it's go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that what that movie does is it bridges to another conversation that we probably need to have, which is because that's just a big budget exploitation film, you know, and that's a whole other kind of branch of this pedigree that we haven't really talked about, which is, you know, obviously Tarantino and Rodriguez were thinking along those lines, but there is, you know, certainly a tradition of low-budget movies that are designed not necessarily with badness in mind, but to deliver a kind of clear, pre-packaged piece of work. You know, I don't know. I'm not really sure how to describe it. But,
well,
you know,
I think I was going to say that it does bring up a really interesting question of bad films. If we take bad films and take exploitation films as bad films, then a good film is a moral film. You know, that doesn't pander to our base, you know, quote unquote desires, and you know, I think that's really problematic. You know, that like a good film is a tasteful moral exercise, and like, you know, that's making a lot of assumptions about what those things are. It's an exercise in good taste and upstanding morals, and if it shows us anything ugly, it's to condemn it and give us something good to walk away with, you know. And I think that that's, you know, a pretty conservative kind of role that a good film can have.
So, of the movies we watch, the one that is most trying to be exploitative and trying to sort of shake up our good moral is my film, the Chillerama. But it's so bad and it's so not effective. But it seems to be the most explicitly trying to shock or trying to use those exploitation. I love exploitation. I think that might be my favorite kind of movie. I love those Herschel Gordon Lewis movies. I love movies that are just about like blood and sex and awful motorcycle. I don't know. But those to me don't fit in the genre of bad movies always. You know.
I don't know. I mean,
transcend.
That's strange to me that Herschel Gordon Lewis isn't so bad. It's good.
I don't know. Yeah, no, it's not that it's bad. Like, it's not the badness that I like. It's just the pure sort of I don't know, amoral. It's got a motive. I can feel that it's moving in a direction. It's got something it's doing. I can feel like it like you said, it moves in a kind of harmony that to me erases any other problems. But like, so okay, I'm kind of, we haven't talked about Chillerama because it's terrible, but I'm kind of wondering like what went wrong with that one. I don't want to hijack your facilitating, Josh, but like when you brought up the exploitation movie, like it seems like it would be fun to do that sort of shaking up of the morals in this kind of movie, and a bad movie would be the place to do that. And when is it effective and when is it not? I don't know.
Well, it seems to me that the number one place where it goes wrong is that it's aggressively unfunny.
Yeah.
You know, and and again, this whole conversation can go in a million directions, and there's a whole other subgenre of kind of horror comedy that fits somewhere in the middle of all this. Uh, there's a question of whether this movie is attempting to pay homage to these types of movies, or whether it's a parody. And if it's a parody, it's a bad parody. And
if it's an homage, it's a bad homage too.
Yeah.
It's true. I don't know what it was trying to do.
Maybe that's the problem, not knowing what something is trying to do, and not caring to find out.
I think that it was like just a very like I don't know, like a misguided kind of, here's part of it, and I think it's the same thing. Grindhouse is successful, I think, because Grindhouse, like, there are like all the aesthetic things that it does, and the kind of formal incidental things that have to do with the kind of Grindhouse experience are there. But I mean, there are films at the core of that film. This is maybe foregrounding like these tropes so much and just like reveling in them that it just becomes like this pornographic, I don't know, like I just, there's something really off-putting, and like this kind of gleeful, this immorality, like this kind of like whatever it's doing, like kind of like this immoral kind of celebration, if that's what you want to like call it, that Chillerama's engaging in, is just, well, A, it's really juvenile,
Yeah.
and B, it's like the most conservative conception of what immorality is, and in a sense just reinforces it, because it's like, this is everything that fucked up people like us like, and it's like, there shouldn't be we all shouldn't agree on that. I don't think. I think that kind of, undercuts the idea that it is very liberated. I don't know. That's how I feel about it.
I think that's pretty well put. That it wanted to shock, and its version of what immoral behavior was so kind of unshocking that.
Yeah.
It's like, like you've never been around a 12-year-old boy before,
Exactly. It's like, mom and dad aren't here, like, this is going to be, we're going to make this crazy movie. And it's like, give me a break. Like, I can't handle this. I wanted to like it too, but
But let me ask you this: do you think that those were inept filmmakers there? I mean, is this a case of creators who are just incapable of what they want to do, or is this a case of too much or too little? Again, because it felt pretty different from, say, Torture Dungeon.
They weren't inept, and that was what was so strange about it. I mean, I think that like the teenage werebears, that was such a sort of a fun. I don't know. The whole idea was so interesting, and it could have been so kind of subversive, the way that some of these movies, these kind of bad quotation mark movies are. But it all fell flat. But the filmmakers aren't bad filmmakers, from what I've seen of their other movies. And also, these movies had sort of a kernel of, I mean, they had interesting, like, there were interesting moments in some of them. Like, there was the Wadzilla one. Even the name makes me want to cringe. The one where there's this moment where a character is watching a television through, like, in a store window, and another character walks by and kind of stops. And then another character. It makes a sort of lovely tableau from like a 50s movie where everyone's watching the news in a television display in a store. And I thought that was such a little clever throwback moment. It was nice. It was well filmed, I thought. But there were little moments of things that could have been interesting, but somehow none of it came together, and it was all so juvenile and not like an exploitation movie, which can genuinely shock you. Like, it can genuinely, viscerally surprise you, which is why I think I like exploitation movies. Like, they can take you to a place that is shocking, and somehow it can do something physically to you. Whereas the only physical thing that this movie does is maybe make you want to vomit or something.
Yeah, but not even.
In a good way. Yeah, not even. You're just kind of annoyed.
It's not worth that. Yeah.
I would have been happy if this movie made me want to vomit. But you know what's interesting about Chillerama, I think, is because I feel it's a copy of a copy. And it's so diluted in a sense because we've been talking about filmmakers that have appropriated the quote-unquote tropes of bad movies this whole episode. Lynch, John Waters, a kind of problematic example, Tarantino, all these people. I mean, this is, film literate filmmakers use these tropes and embrace these kind of beautiful things and powerful things, radical things about quote unquote bad films. Chillerama acts like that never happened. Like, you guys ever notice that there's some movies that are just really bad and weird? It's like, yeah, we know. Like,
yeah, no, I think that I believe that it wants to be a kind of parody, but it doesn't actually have enough love for its subject matter to be effective at that. I think that in order to parody something appropriately, you have to have at least enough respect for what you're talking about to do it well. And the kind of mean-spiritedness toward the subject matter that I worried about, talking about that kind of Mystery Science Theater kind of reaction. I think that's what this whole movie is. It's that mean-spirited reaction to, 50 years worth of filmmaking.
I also just want to say it's very panderous, and that was really grated on me.
So we're just going to clarify for any listeners, we don't like this movie very much.
And that's funny because we started by kind of saying, we won't specifically talk about the films too much because there's these pretty general questions. But we pretty much arrived at a pretty hardcore hate fest on Chillerama in a very specific way. So,
well, I think it's worthwhile to try and figure out, because, I think even Letitia, who says she doesn't like, this genre of movie very much, could differentiate between a kind of badness that contains some kernel of enjoyment. Yeah. And Chillerama,
Exactly.
that there's something different in those experiences.
Maybe in a sense, Chillerama serves the purpose that I was talking about that bad movies traditionally serve, is that it really, it kind of made us even more aware of the kind of structures and positive elements and the good things about real bad movies, whereas this is version of badness is just bad. But I don't know, it kind of that was
it was a noble effort, Chris.
Okay, sorry.
You did your best, but I'm afraid the movie's not going to hold up under the weight. Sorry. I have this feeling, guys, that we could talk all night and we would not be able to come to any sort of comfortable answers about most of the questions that we've raised tonight, but I did enjoy talking about it, and I'm going to just continue. That experience of the video store that I had when I was a kid, nowadays it's the Netflix instant queue, and if anything, we have more access to really low budget, really horrible movies than ever before. And I'll kind of, as my parting words, I think I'll say that there is something, and maybe Letitia's right, and it's just nostalgia, but there are an awful lot of bad movies on Netflix that I can't get through the first 5 minutes of, and when they're working right, there is something about this campy kind of horror fest that really does get at something that a lot of bad movies just don't. And so, Chris, I'm proud. And
That's good.
I'm going to keep watching.
Excellent. Yes.
Well, thank you guys for suggesting the genre, whoever did. I guess it's Josh, right? Because I never would have seen any of these, and I really am happy that I did. And even though I don't like the genre that much, I guess I appreciate it now, and this was a great conversation. I had so much fun.
And yes, thank you very much. It's something, this is a genre I'm very, if we can call it genre, I'm very passionate about, and this is really insightful.
All right. Well, thank you guys. It's been a good time, and we'll see everybody at the next episode. Good night.